Good evening, Dublin, and good morning, Los Angeles. I hope it's a clear line for all of you. It's a lovely day here, and it looks as if it's quite good in Los Angeles as well. Colm, are you hearing me loud and clear?
It's a beautiful morning here.
Thank you. Well, we have a lot of lawyers listening, so I'm conscious that I have to stick to the programme and stay roughly on topic, but I'm going to take the liberty of setting the scene a little bit, if I may, and I know I've warned you already. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to leave the master out of the conversation, so I may ask you a little bit about that. Tell us, because you and I will remember what Dublin was like in the 1980s, but we're speaking to many members of the young bar who didn't perhaps live through that interesting time that fashion forgot. Give us a thumbnail sketch of living in Dublin in the 70s and 80s.
In certain ways, it was a bitter time where divisions over those issues to do with, say, homosexuality, divorce, contraception, civil liberties in general, that these were areas of, I suppose, hot dispute, I suppose, with the abortion referendum being at the centre, where the divisions really were bitter, and where obviously the divisions within families, but I mean divisions within the society, where you had doctors and serious doctors and lawyers and serious lawyers coming out in favour of a referendum which other lawyers and other doctors claimed would be unworkable and unusable. And so that those debates were very large ones. I mean, I remember huge crowds in Liberty Hall and various other places. And certainly I was working as a journalist, and there became also a group of people who I suppose were national hate figures who were seen to be on the right, who were sometimes doctors, sometimes politicians, and sometimes lawyers. And so it was a very uneasy time if you were like me, if you were, say, gay like I am, or if you were liberal like I am, or if you had a lot of friends, you know, as women who were, I mean, absolutely upset about the abortion referendum as being the whole idea of their bodies being used, and used politically at certain moments, where it looked as though politicians were actually building up a reputation because of their sort of anti-abortion views. And of course, in the middle of this, there was the North. So, I mean, I'm not going to go on about the North, but certainly the 80s were punctuated by IRA bombs. Most notably, I suppose, the one in Enniskillen, but many other ones as well. So that even though the Anglo-Irish Agreement took place in 1985, and even though it did seem a sort of step forward, it didn't end the violence. And so it was a bitter, difficult time. I mean, it wasn't like that every day, but looking back on it, certainly those were the issues that preoccupied people, and that people had fierce debates about, you know, at home and, you know, in pubs and in everywhere.
So this was just to give us a little idea or a flavour of the legal or the political landscape, just personally, before and we'll certainly be going back to the 1980s, because I see that, I think, as being formative in terms of your later writing, certainly in the Heather Blazing. But you had spent your early life in Wexford. Anyone who has read the book knows that. And then you've mentioned you were a journalist in Dublin. You'd also lived in Spain, I think. What country in the 1980s was home?
Ireland was home. You know, I went to live in Barcelona when I graduated in 1985, and I witnessed the extraordinary change in every single thing in life in Spain because of democracy. Because the idea of the dictatorship ending, would put a piece of paper into a ballot box, literally changed the whole atmosphere in the streets. And there was a huge amount of early reforming legislation, which really just changed every way people lived in Spain. So I had seen how politics could work. Ireland was home, Wexford was home. So that idea of getting the train used to stop at Westland Row in those years, and just getting the train to Enniscorthy was really a journey home. I mean, like a lot of people in Dublin, I was, I suppose, a culture, an outsider. But so that's, and by 1983, at the age of 27, Vincent Brown, who owned McGill magazine and had edited it for many years, he was going to the Sunday Tribune, and he offered me the job as editor of McGill. So that by 1983, that's what I was doing. I was sitting in an editorial chair with a lot of responsibility, and you know, again, the technology was so primitive for the production of magazines. It was actually paste. You were actually using glue to paste the pages down. I mean, that's almost unimaginable as an idea now, but that was the case in 1983, 84, 85.
I'm going to come back to that because I think there's a very, very clear link between your work for McGill and what most, and I think yourself, you've publicly said that this was a backdrop for the scenes in the Heather Blazing, and I do want to come to that. But again, just to stay with the background for the moment, because you mentioned the train to Enniscorthy, and from reading the Heather Blazing in particular, the Wexford countryside appears to be almost a character in the novel. It's so detailed and the sense of erosion of land by sea and by time. I see it again in The Master, where Henry James settles in Rye in Lan House. There's more references to that phenomenon. And just before I move to the very core of the book we want to look at, could you say anything about that? Is that something that resonates particularly with you?
Yeah, the book is set part of it is set on the Wexford coast, and that's real. I mean, that's a part would go from the Blackwater being the village down to Ballyconnegar, Upper Ballyconnegar, Lower, Knocknasillogue along there. And there is erosion, and there has been since I was a kid. It's where you would go down in the summer. I mean, we would not be there in the winter, so you'd go down in, for example, in the month of June, and suddenly realize that a whole bit of the cliff had fallen in and just gone. My father's first cousin, Dick Whelan, his house fell in. Now that was a big deal if you're a kid, where someone's house falls over the cliff into the sea. And so I put all that into the book, also because it was lost in the sense that we didn't go there anymore. It was I think if you're a novelist, landscape that's gone, that you don't go to anymore, that has changed fundamentally, that becomes something you can use in a novel. It's almost a way of recovering it, as though by writing it, you could sort of get it back. You could slow time down, you could put time back. And so I put that landscape into the book.
And can I also ask you, one of my colleagues asked this question and I hadn't thought it through, but I realized I was curious myself. I know the title, The Heather Blazing, comes from Ula Vogue, and I wondered, was there any particular reason for that phrase and that context of, I think it was Father Murphy's campaign to alert the people of Wexford to call them to arms, as it were?
I liked the sound of the phrase, the Heather Blazing, but it's also ironic. It's, you know, the novel is set in a very, very stable Republic of Ireland. That the chances of, the forecourts ever being burned again seemed really remote. And there's a sense of absolute quietness and stability in the Republic of Ireland. And so the title is ironic in the sense that there may be Heather Blazing elsewhere, for example, in the north, and that comes up in the book. But there's no Heather Blazing. Yes. You know, there's a sort of dullness. So it is an ironic title in that sense.
And it's only your second novel, and you're still only in your 30s when you wrote it, and you gave Eamonn Redmond your own father, effectively. Is that fair?
Elements of him are my father, and elements of him are also my own childhood. For example, I use the whole business of being an altar boy, which is mine. Yes. But my father was involved with Fianna Fáil. It was, again, it's hard to imagine a time when the minister, who was the local TD, was Dr. Ryan. He was the Minister for Finance. Mm-hmm. And he had been in the GPO in 1916 as a medical student, and he was TD for Wexford. But he lived in Delgany, so he didn't live in the constituency. And I don't think he ever appeared much in the constituency. This meant that the Fianna Fáil figures in the towns had much more power than they might have had, you know, otherwise. Mm-hmm. And my father was the Fianna Fáil figure in Enniscorthy. And his brother, his older brother, also, they were the stalwarts of the Fianna Fáil party. They're always going to Fianna Fáil meetings. They weren't at Fianna Fáil meetings, they were at meetings of the Vincent de Paul. And if it wasn't the Vincent de Paul, it was some other thing too. For example, all the stuff about starting the Castle Museum in Enniscorthy happened. In other words, I was the child with my father going down to the museum. so all of that is autobiographical. What's made up, which is an interesting thing, I'm not the only novelist who's done it, is I've wiped out the rest of the family, which must be out of some sort of Freudian sort of dream of wanting to be an only child. But Eamonn is an only child, and so I had 4 siblings, and my mother was alive. So I just got, for the purposes of the novel, I got rid of all of them. And it was just me and my father. Because by the time I wrote the book, my father was dead. So there was also an element in the book of recovering that, of seeing it, a way of refining it.
Yes. And you made him a lawyer and a judge.
I did. What happened was that because I was editing the magazine, and it was a monthly magazine, I was really busy for 2 weeks of every month. For the other 2 weeks, it was really quite quiet, and I needed a big project. So I took on a few, for the very beginning, listed what I was going to do over each year. And one project was to write a history of the Supreme Court for the magazine. There'd be no problem over length. I think it ended up being 30,000 words.
Yes.
It was a project I took a year to do. And it involved reading huge numbers of judgments. Look, there was nothing to go on. No one, Ruan McCormack's book, there weren't books like that.
Yes.
So what I then started to do was to contact anyone who would talk to me. So obviously some senior barristers at the time were just amazing. They just knew how the whole thing had worked. And of course, when it was pointed out to me that there was a huge change in the way the Constitution was interpreted. And this change began with the appointment of 2 judges who had some connections to Fianna Fáil, who were Carol O'Dowley and Brian Walsh, and that they had initiated, they had asked barristers, to their consternation, the question, are there any American precedents? American precedents?
Unheard of.
This is circa 1959, 60. No, I mean, the questions were always about English law, and they were the precedents people mentioned were English precedents. And the American Bar Society presented the Irish bar with the books, with whatever books they were going to need to use American precedent. But this was seen by people as a sort of, not exactly Fianna Fáil, but a sort of nationalist, a sort of way of, we have a constitution, has anyone read it? Does anyone know what is implied in some of its articles? And so a quiet revolution occurred in the way the Irish constitution was interpreted, and that this was done by a sort of new generation of judges. And when I saw that, I thought, well, that would be an interesting moment for Fianna Fáil, where because the bar was so much associated with Fine Gael up to then, that the judges, that there was a sort of Belvedere to bar library line that would have included a lot of people like Johnny Costello, for example, were senior barristers, and that didn't happen in the same way with Fianna Fáil. So I became interested in this. I also became interested in the idea of the judgment, of the written judgment, the dissenting judgment, the crafted judgment, and the idea, of course, that Supreme Court judgment, some of them seem to me to be highly crafted. Some of them seem to me to be almost literary in the way they were crafted. There was one judge, Neil McCarthy, who I think enjoyed very much his own prose style, but others of them were very densely argued, and they looked to me as though they had gone through a lot of revision. So I'm interested then in connecting, in a way, the writing of a novel, which involves a lot of revision, of being at home at night in a room, working something out, revising it. But a second thing interested me, that a novelist, your job is to write the book. It involves a sort of self-suppression, in that your opinions don't matter. Don't put your opinions into your book. Give everything to your character. Move away, maintain a distance from who you are to who the protagonist of your book is. And I found in the way that judges would talk about the ideas that they might have very strong views on something personally, but actually the evidence, they would have to look at the evidence given. look at the precedents, look at the law, that their judgments were not a personal rant, as it were, in the same way as a novelist cannot do a personal rant. These are of no interest. So that I was interested in that idea of the self or self-suppression in a way a judgment would be written. So all this began to intrigue me.
And this is very interesting to me and a surprise to some extent, because I had read of your case in the Supreme Court, Cullen versus Tóibín, and presumed, quite wrongly it seems, that this was one of the reasons that drew you to thinking about the law, thinking about the Constitution. But clearly this was a process that began long before you yourself went to court.
Yes, but it was exactly. I mean, that was a key moment where this is a case to do with a thing called prior restraint. And
yes. Tell the listeners a little bit about this, because they may not know.
Yes, it's basically McGill was publishing an article about a court case where the jury had already decided, and there probably was going to be an appeal, but the appeal would be to judges rather than a jury, and it would be on matters of law rather than on matters of fact. And so our point was, look, the case is effectively over in the sense that not a newspaper or magazine article could not influence judges. Now, we went into they sought an injunction to prevent publication before publication. The judge decided to give them this injunction, which of course we thought was very serious, because obviously it was going to stop the publication of the magazine 2 weeks before Christmas, when all the advertising was really heavy, where we really made money on those Christmas issues, which we didn't some other issues. And if we lost one issue like that, it would be a huge blow to us. So we decided to go into the Supreme Court. Now, I have to say the Chief Justice I believe, was really uneasy about taking it, because he had to take this case really quickly. And we went in and watched, and the judges were not flattered at the idea that their views on a matter of law might be influenced by a mere magazine article. So in other words, the first judge had just been appalled in a way by that he felt the case was still ongoing, and the article was just, you know, at the wrong moment. But the Supreme Court judges got very, I mean, they really weren't having this for a moment. So they lifted the injunction. And of course, I got a sense of them, just the sense of, you know, the Chief Justice in the middle. Neil McCarthy was over to his left, watching like a hawk, because for him, the idea that this article could affect his view was really anathema, you know. And yeah, so that was, I mean, I hadn't begun to work on the Supreme Court article at that point, but it certainly spurred me on. It gave me a real sense. Also, I had to spend a lot of time with lawyers, building up. I mean, in other words, there were 2 intense days where we looked at every precedent. What was, of course, fascinating was that we found a huge amount, because it's a huge issue in American law because of American concern with freedom of speech, and we found vast precedents for lifting restrictions. The prior restraint was something Americans do very, very sparingly. And but our lawyer, who later became a distinguished judge, I noticed him at a certain point very early on in the argument just sitting down, and he didn't speak again. And he left his opponent to be really wiped out by the Supreme Court judges. And he didn't speak again. And afterwards said, I saw we were winning and I thought I'd sit down, which I thought was a marvelous thing to learn, you know, that, and despite the huge amount of material he had, he didn't use it.
Was that Mr. Mackey by any chance?
It was Rex Mackey on the other side.
Ah,
it was,
who was your distinguished lawyer?
And Mr. Gagan on our side.
Well, that's very interesting. And you have, that's a picture now for many of us who know the people who are involved. Moving then into the world of the heather blazing, I can see shades and perhaps some pictures that were drawn first when you were sitting in court yourself. You describe the lawyers and the judges at one point. You describe them as being semi-tribal in their loyalties. Did you get any sense that there were barristers or lawyers then that weren't subscribing to a tribe? Did you see it as being very divided?
What happened was that I then started to phone individual judges, and one of them took a very dim view of being phoned in his chambers by me, and told me, that I really should not phone again. I mean, he was very serious about it, that he didn't speak to journalists under any circumstances. What was strange was that others were absolutely friendly, totally open, and said, yes, come down and see me. Some of them made absolutely clear in advance, I cannot talk about my career as a judge. I cannot talk about judgments, but I can take you through what happened during my life as a barrister. And one or two were actually much more open to telling me anything I wanted to know. And I realized that within the Supreme Court, there were divisions. There were not huge divisions. I mean, it wasn't like the American Supreme Court. It wasn't at all like that, in fact. Yeah. And as a journalist, you'd be careful not to overemphasize divisions. But certainly the issue, and I have written about this separately, so it's not is that Brian Walsh was in a very peculiar position at that time, because he had agreed, I think foolishly, to become president of the Law Reform Commission. I know the Law Reform Commission is probably very important, but it did not seem so at that time. In other words, its recommendations were in general not being taken, in any way seriously. And he had an office across in Stephen's Green, which sort of separated him from the court. He was very gruff. He spoke with a very particular accent, which was very far away from the normal barrister tone that I would have associated, say, with Adrian Hardiman. And indeed, Neil McCarthy had a particular barrister tone they used, which was quite, let's say, posh in some way. Brian Walsh's accent was emphatically not that. He sort of mumbled a sort of north side Dublin accent, and you wouldn't realise that what he was saying was so important if you didn't listen really carefully to him. And whereas the others were, Adrian Hardiman or Neil McCarthy would. Neil McCarthy, when I went to see him, and I think this might be useful for people who want to become judges in the future, he had a very good lunch waiting for me, and he said he'd been working hard all morning, that he was writing a Clerihew. And I said, yes, a Clerihew. And he said, do you know what a Clerihew is? And I said, I did. And he recited me his Clerihew. A Clerihew is a short poem which has an intricate rhyming system that must begin with the name of a person. So his was: Marcel Proust abused everyone he knew when he wrote À la recherche du temps perdu. And this was a judge, a Supreme Court judge, really amusing himself in some way at my expense, because I could, so that's what he was like. And the Chief Justice, Tom Higgins, was really very interesting about, his family, and but he wasn't ready to talk about judgments. And the issue was that Brian Walsh had told me, and that the big question was, who would sit in the Supreme Court on the night where Dominic McGlinchey, who was, really on the run as a, well, it wasn't exactly IRA, but it was sort of worse than the IRA. But he was notorious, and he was on the run, and he was captured, and there was a warrant for his arrest, for his extradition to Northern Ireland. Now, the issue was, of course, he committed crimes in the South as well. What should happen? The Chief Justice was emphatic that he should be extradited, because there really was huge pressure from the British, and Peter Sutherland as Attorney General, that all of them were concerned that the British were actually reading that the South was a safe haven for terrorists. And remember, these are the years of Margaret Thatcher. She was really emphatic about this. So she was on the war path, and so he was captured. It was a Saturday, and who was going to sit in the Supreme Court to decide? It was just to be a 3-judge court, because it was just about a extradition warrant. Mm-hmm. And Brian Walsh told me that he had been he had been phoned by the Chief Justice to say, was he available, and he had given the Chief Justice his opinion that Dominic McGlinchey should not be extradited, and the Chief Justice did not phone him back. And there were other judges on the court, and Dominic McGinty was extradited, which proved in the end actually wrong because there wasn't actually enough evidence against him in the north. But anyway, my interest, of course, became there was one other judge who was important here. It's a judge called Rory O'Hanlon, and he was very well known as somebody who was really anti-abortion and anti any change in the sort of conservative nature of the state. When I phoned him, he couldn't have been friendlier. He couldn't have been nicer. When I went to see him, he could not have been more forthcoming. And there was a moment that really gave me the novel. I think the moment where I really saw the novel was where I'm in his chambers. It is the afternoon. He is talking. And suddenly his tipstaff comes in and says, you must come. And he puts on his robes and he goes. He leaves me in his room. And I'm looking out the window and it's the river and all that. And then he comes back about half an hour later and says, that was just almost speaking to himself. That was a funny case. I would have thought they would have come back with manslaughter. And then he comes on talking, meaning that in the half an hour he was away, someone had been found guilty of murder by a jury, and he had sentenced them to life imprisonment, which is a mandatory sentence. And I realized in my half-hour dreaming, someone had been sentenced to life in prison. A judge, I thought this is funny. This because he seemed to me so human. He was, of all of them, I think he was the one who was so friendly, and he reminded me of my father and my father's brother. Those sort of gruff men who could be very gruff in company, very kind to their families, happier with their daughters than with their sons. I could list a whole number of things, and rigorous in the way they dealt with work, serious about work, and about also a sort of loyalty to the state that they didn't even have to mention. There was really believed in Ireland, and so in those encounters especially with Brian Walsh and Rory O'Hanlon, there was a sort of manners question. There's a question of how they conducted, with their voices, their gruffness, their funny friendliness, and their interest in, Brian Walsh would have had an interest in the word liberty. The word liberty mattered, in what liberty meant, and but of course both of them were very conservative on the social issues. So I had nothing in common with them before I went into the room, but then in the room I did.
It was very male, a very male environment.
Do
you see much change?
Robbins dominated for that reason, in that she was always available to journalists. She kept her distance in certain ways. She was formidable, but of course her knowledge and her intellect were just great, and so that she was. The other thing was, if you wanted to know anything, I mean, if you were needed a detail, something you couldn't remember, or something you wanted to know, that the person who knew most in Ireland was Jared Hogan, who at the time was a young academic in Trinity. And
that's
again,
still the case, Colm. That's still the case.
Yeah, that he just had an extraordinary knowledge. And I mean, this is all those years ago. This is what, 30 years ago. Is it? This is 40 years ago. That he, as a young academic, was a walking encyclopedia of knowledge. Well,
I'm going to just tell those who are listening that the report of your case in respect of the freedom of the press is in the 1984 edition of the Irish Law Reports Monthly, if anyone wants to look it up. And in the High Court, you were described as a talented journalist who wrote with verve.
Yes, that word verve was taken up by Neil McCarthy in the Supreme Court, sarcastically saying, the article, I believe, is written with verve. And he used the word verve as being, absolute contempt for the idea of verve.
I think, did your final depiction of Judge Redmond, did he differ from your initial idea of when you set out to write the novel? Did he change as you wrote?
Yes, that always happens with a book, where you have some terrible ideas along the way. And part of the process of writing is not merely that you're writing the novel, you're dropping some terrible ideas. Early on, I had an idea that I would make him a sort of hypocrite, you know, that he would be having an affair with someone and he would be doing that at the same time as he was giving judgments about social questions. And I realized that, again, this is an idea, you know, don't do that. Give him an autonomy, you know, that let him live. Don't put your own, oh, you know, if the idea that if a judge was preaching or if a judge was giving judgments which seemed conservative, he himself would have to have a private life that was in some way hypocritical. That's a terrible idea. I mean, that's just stupid. And don't put it into your novel. So that give him a sort of freedom. And so his relationship to his wife is, I mean, he does care for her in a way, but he is distant. And I wanted that idea of his solitariness, of his standing apart from other judges even, and of his, you know, going from the forecourts home, not being clubbable or social, none of that, not being a member of the Stephen's Green Club, you know, that world not interesting. Golf, for example, isn't his thing, you know, so that he's closer to Brian Walsh in that sense of being socially distant. And I wanted to give him a very rich inner life, a sort of haunted by memories, and but also in the courtroom really formidable. I mean, really somebody who really people feared, you know, and but also that some of these judgments coming towards him really things that a judge cannot decide on. So the big moment was that idea. I mean, it's in the preamble to the Constitution where I think it's mentioned. I think the Holy Family is the Holy Ghost even gets into the Irish Constitution. That he just is a big moment where he's just trying to work out from where does this judgment come? What are my principles? When I say that, you know, something should happen in an Irish town, what does it come from? Yes, the Constitution, but what does the Constitution come from? What are the principles? What sort of, I mean, is there something antecedent? And of course, he comes across the word God, and he writes it, and then he crosses it out, and that, you know, for somebody like him, that idea that actually doesn't have, there isn't a set of principles before the principles in the Constitution that he can easily refer to. And so I wanted to work all that out. In a way, I suppose it was a novel about the way the Republic of Ireland had formed itself and the way in which it had separated itself from the North. And I was interested in, you know, I suppose someone like T.K. Whitaker being a crucial figure, being, you know, the civil servant in the Department of Finance who wrote the Program for Economic Expansion, 1959, but he becomes an important advisor to Jack Lynch in the 60s about keeping the South out of the North, about making sure your language is never provocative. And Eamonn Redmond becomes a crucial figure in advising the government. How do you keep one country safe from another when the one beside you is burning? And he looks at various situations, including indeed Israel. You know, in other words, that he writes them a report, which is to actually just outline the principles in which the Republic of Ireland no building will burn again in the Republic of Ireland after the burning of the British Embassy in January or early February 1972. In other words, how did that happen? What was the ideology behind that? So I was sort of teasing out all that in the novel, as well as teasing out various demons from my own childhood.
You've spoken about that quite recently, in fact, about describing your father's illness, for instance. And you described that in The Master as, I think, making a raid on your own memories.
Yeah, it's
an important technique for you.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it's something I think that every novelist does. I notice, for example, John McGahern, that entire business of his mother, his mother's death, and his father being a policeman or a guard, that makes its way into so many of the books. So I think there's some writers who do that, who use again and again images from childhood, things that matter, things that keep you awake at night. that they make their way into the book, and you transform them. It isn't therapy. It isn't like going to a psychoanalyst. It's getting them and using them, finding a place for them. So so you have to be quite hard in the way that you work. In this, is this needed here? Not do I need to say this here, but does the book need it? Yeah. And so you work from that.
I don't know if this answers the question I had, but it reminds me of a question I had, which was, what is the impact on you of sharing such very, very personal issues so publicly?
I suppose the novel form is a way of trying to get something that's private and make it matter to a reader. So in other words, it's a form of communication. So you're not involved in entertainment. It's not part of the entertainment industry. That it does have, I suppose, a moral center, something to do, offering a paradigm or a set of patterns as to how people might live or how people could live. And so you're sort of imagining something. You've got to be careful that you're not idealizing it, or you're not, especially that you're not sentimentalizing it, that you're not just saying, look how sad all this is, look how sorry everyone should be for the character or for me, but you're actually involved in creating something that is both personal and public, and that connects the two, and that offers the reader a sort of vision of otherness, which again I think has connections to the law, where a judge under certain circumstances is actually involved in trying to imagine a set of circumstances on the basis of information given and seeing what it looks like then. In that, as a novelist, that's what you're doing, that you're sort of imagining a world. The reason you're doing this is that, or the value of it is that all of us need to imagine not only ourselves, but others. And that this is how our society or everything we do depends on the idea that we are not just alone in our lives living them, but that we can see what somebody else, for example, I think the pandemic is a good example of that, and we can actually see that what's happening to others really, really matters in some way in a society. So that a novel is just one way of enacting that, or of offering a blueprint for it.
I'm looking, as you speak, I'm looking at one of the very few passages that I had copied to have in front of me as I spoke to you, and it's Eamonn Redmond's words in the novel, that it was not his job to decide what certain terms, such as the family, had meant in the past. It was his job to know what these terms meant now. And he seems to be struggling with that for all of the reasons you've outlined. It's not a legal decision, it's a moral one. And he
yes.
hasn't any experience of the other family.
Yeah, this has become a big issue in American constitutional law between Judge Scalia, for example, and Amy Coney Barrett and other judges. In what tense is the Constitution written? If it's written in the present tense, surely it could be interpreted as being present, as being now, so that a word in the Constitution must be interpreted in the light of what that word means now. And the other one's saying, no, we have to look at the framers of the Constitution. We have to look at, in Ireland, if it's Ireland, we have to look at what a word meant in 1937. Other people saying, no, but I don't know if that still argument is still going on. But certainly when I think it was Brian Walsh said to me, the Constitution is written in the present tense. Yeah. Oh, wow, that is actually a revelation to me. I didn't know that. And I thought that was something I was going to put straight into my book. In other words, sometimes you're like a magpie, you're wandering around trying to see something glittering. And that struck me as a sort of glittering fact.
Transformative in a very conservative legal environment. This could change everything.
Yeah.
Can I tell you, if you didn't know this already, last week, in fact, pretty much at this time last week, the Walking Encyclopedia, that is Gerard Hogan, who has just been appointed to the Supreme Court, presented a paper to a number of his colleagues, to a number of us. And in that paper, he chose Eamonn Redmond as the only fictional example he gave of a judge with a dilemma. And he focused very much on the consternation, and that was your word, the consternation it would cause his colleagues if he redefined the family in this judgment. And the influence that must have had on this fictional judge. As 11 o'clock grew near, he knew that what he had written on the foolscap pages, that was going to be the judgment he would deliver. And his colleagues would view it as sensible and well-reasoned.
Yes, that was very much part of, I mean, this book was being written in the late 80s, early 90s. And I was thinking, you know, how will this change come when it comes? And it will come, of course, with the redefinition of the word family. And so, you know, what sort of, you know, is a mother and a child, the mother not being married? If that does not constitute a family, how come? If a widow and a child. So, you know, part of that reasoning comes from Neil McCarthy's astonishing judgment in the Norris case, where I'm not going to give it to you now, but it's where he lists what people can do sexually, legally and illegally, and points out the illogic of that. And I mean, it was very explicit what he said, but I was thinking the same way. How would you redefine a family? And he's almost tempted, because he can see the logic of it, to do so. So it's that moment where here he is, and the logic is leading him here, but he realizes there's something else leading him there. And it's a drama. I mean, to try and, you see, part of the job in a novel is to try and create drama. If there's no drama, there's no novel. So you have to get two things that oppose each other. And so that trying to get him in the night, thinking about this and make that dramatic and make it also completely comprehensible for the reader, that this would not only change the country, but it would change the way people see him. And he's not ready for that. He's not.
He's not ready.
That's not who he is. He's not a. I mean, one of the reasons why he's been appointed to these positions and he's respected in this way is that he's never going to do anything like that. So, I mean, I was interested in the novel in exploring the conservative mind and finding the very opposite to myself and seeing how that opposite worked, how it lived its day, how he lived his day, and what his dilemmas were. So that's really what I was working with.
And do you think it's still the case, you don't have to name anybody, that we're all appointed because we're not really going to change anything?
Well, you know, I suppose there were moments, certainly in the early 1960s, when the Supreme Court caused nothing but consternation with some of its judgments. I mean, in other words, the right to use contraception, you know, the famous McGee case, but also I think the Norris case itself, because it must have disturbed people very deeply. What actually happened in the case, which people will know that it was a 3-2 judgment, but that the Chief Justice's judgment used evidence that wasn't actually given to the court and wasn't tested in the court. And this was pointed out to him by Judge Henchy, who said this was not exactly unprecedented, but it was certainly unacceptable. And but even the fact that it came so close, and that would go on to Europe in 1988 and would win in Europe, that idea of that these rights were coming to us via the judges, not via the politicians. And I think there were moments when the judges certainly felt the politicians should be taking more active. And Neil McCarthy said this. Said it was, you know, these are matters for government. Leaving them to the courts is a mistake. But certainly in the issue, say the question of bail became a huge question in the 1970s. Who got bail and who didn't? And so they were always saying that this was to do with the Constitution, to do with ideas of, Brian Walsh would have talked about the ideas of liberty in the Constitution, the idea of what he said, I remember him saying to me, was that the idea of innocence before guilt, it's not just a formula. it's active. It actually literally means something. And if you do that, then the question of bail becomes, interesting, because you say, well, why should someone not? Anyway, you know the arguments, and these were fascinating arguments.
I'm tempted to laugh now, because some of those listening will probably know I'm sitting in the bail list at the moment, Colm. So I'm very live to the argument every week.
I mean, I'm really talking about the principles that govern this.
I know, and as you know, because Mr. Justice McCarthy said it back in 1984, a mere journalist wouldn't influence me anyway, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
But
he said
a world-renowned novelist might have more sway, so I better not listen to any of your arguments in respect to bail. Can I ask you, I'm conscious of time, and I really would like, there are a few other things I'd really like to ask about, and I know there have been some questions coming in, some of which I think I've dealt with to some extent. I'm very conscious of, I reread The Master when I knew I was going to have this privilege. And it begins, as you probably remember, with a powerful and very painful description of this wonderful novelist having a foray into the theatre, into the world of the theatre, which ends disastrously. Sorry, spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't read it, terribly sorry. You're going to have to read it anyway. But you have now, with your experience, I think, with Brooklyn, at least, if nothing else, you've had a taste of that idea. I think Henry James is very drawn to the theatre, the idea of moving from what he calls the grim satisfaction, in your words for him, the grim satisfaction of fiction, moving into the immediacy and movement of theatre. And of course, he's gutted, effectively, when this does not work out. It's a really harrowing beginning to any novel. Tell me a little bit about your experiences coming into the world of film.
Well, I didn't write the screenplay for Brooklyn. It was written by Nick Hornby, and this meant that when Nick Hornby was nominated for an Academy Award, with Saoirse Ronan and all the others, he could go in one door, which was the red carpet, and but I was just a novelist, and I was to sit at the back, so I went in another door of the Academy Awards, and it was certainly as though this is what Hollywood thinks about novelists. But there was another moment where I had a play that opened on Broadway. And this was after I had written the account of Henry James's humiliation in the theatre. And there was a party afterwards in Sardis, which is where the parties are held for opening nights. And one moment I'm with my back to the door, and there's a crowd behind me, and there's a lot of people in the room. And in 5 minutes, when the New York Times review comes in, and it isn't great, the room clears. New Yorkers simply go home. They don't wait. They don't say goodnight. They just go. So when I turned and looked, everyone behind me is gone. What's happened? And so I said, well, the review has come out, the review. And so I think if you're a novelist where you work 3 or 4 years on something, and a novel is reviewed maybe 30, 40 times, so that you get a variety of responses to the book. And a book, no matter what you do with it, has a life in libraries, in people's bookcases, but or in bookshops. It's never going to go. Whereas the theatre will literally disappear. It's like breathing on glass, and you just wipe it and it's gone. So the difference between the two is enormous. And I think that any novelist, I don't know a novelist who has gone into the theatre and come out happily. It's a bruising experience, and I think Hollywood is the same. That it's not for us, and it was a very funny night, because we were so close to the door that every time there was a break, and there were breaks every 5 minutes for ads, you could go out and they had little glasses of white wine waiting for you each time, and so it was. I mean, there are other things you realize. Just for one night, I got what maybe a lot of people that work in Hollywood get. I was told that my car, I had it for the entire night until I was ready to go home. That I could, it was from 5 o'clock in the afternoon until 5 o'clock in the morning. I had a driver waiting for me anywhere I wanted to go. And of course, I immediately said, well, could we go to Mexico? Could we go, this is Los Angeles, could we go to Mexico? I drive through the night, and but it was good because we could go to various parties, and he could wait for me outside, and it was like being a star. But then, of course, in the morning you woke up and you realize you're back in the business of, a novel is 1,000 details. And you're back with your 1,000 details.
And funny to listen to you describe it. It seems, you remind me of your description of Henry James. Did you identify with him very strongly?
I think the idea of becoming middle-aged and spending a lot of time alone, and you know, I was using my own life in certain ways, you know, and so yeah, there are elements there, but there's also a sense of him that I was trying to work with, of how much fierce energy he has. There's a sense almost of him physically settling down to work, but yeah, I used bits of myself in that. But there was so much information available about Henry James, with so many biographies and letters, and so it was lovely, because you felt you do a lot of research, and it was very useful. It's good.
But the personal, of course, is, in my view, certainly what made the book such a memorable one, and such an enjoyable one. It becomes more personal to write it in that way. And speaking of our personal, again, looking at Eamonn Redmond, that perhaps is another reason for the success of the ideas behind the Heather Blazing, and the success of the full novel, is that you had so much that was part of your own life that made it very real.
Yes,
quite a real character.
I was brought up by in a world where a lot of older men were grumpy. It was part of the deal. If the women were all talking, and there was a lot of excitement over the smallest thing, if an aunt came to visit. But if an uncle came to visit, he could sit in the back room smoking, talking about some goal that had been scored on Sunday. And it would be pretty dull stuff. And there would be an element of, especially in relation to children, of those men being grumpy. And that obviously interested me, as, I mean, what is the inner life of a grumpy man like?
And did you, having written the book, and having the relationships you've described with various judges and barristers, did a very good question has come in from David Davenpower here. Did the process of writing this book change your view of judges generally?
I don't think so. I suppose I did get to think a lot about the levels of power. One of the funny things that happened with the book was that judges started to read it, and so I got Anthony Kennedy from the American Supreme Court got in touch with me, and we had supper in Washington. And of course, I realized as I was talking to him that he was the man who had decided Gore Bush. You know, that his was the vote that gave the presidency to George W. Bush, but also his was the vote that meant that any law, state law against homosexual acts was prohibited by the Supreme Court, and that was his thing. So when I asked him, you know, that question you asked, what's the judgment that you most care about, that you most want your legacy? He said, oh, the gay one, that judgment is mine. But I wanted to say, well, how do you feel about George W. now that, you know, but in other words, you're dealing with, in a way, sometimes ordinary people. I mean, he wasn't that evening, I wasn't with somebody who struck me as exceptional in any way, but he had a key moment, this astonishing amount of power, which resulted in the election of W, but also the striking down of all the anti-gay stuff that was in very conservative states. So that idea of power, which in a way a politician doesn't have, you always got to worry about the constituency. And a judge does have, because there really isn't a constituency there. You know, that's the whole point of the independence. And yeah, also, I suppose I felt that we don't think about it enough, but the Republic of Ireland has been a sort of success. And part of the success, I mean, success in the sense that it's a stable society in which people really do believe in its institutions. I think we saw this during the pandemic, where people really will listen to somebody, won't believe that. No one thinks that someone in the health area is being paid by the pharmaceutical. No one thinks that. In the same way as I never came across, ever, I don't think, anyone talking about corruption in the judiciary. You know, the Republic of Ireland, there's a funny sort of decency and stability. And in a way, that's what the Heather Blazing was trying to tease out and dramatize.
And can I ask you, do you think, this may be obvious to others, but it makes me curious, Eamonn Redmond, having rebuilt his relationship with his daughter, having welcomed his little grandson into his life, the very last scene, he's in the sea with this little boy, do you think he would have written a different judgment at the end of the novel?
Yeah, there is an element of him softening and of him seeing things differently. So there is a sort of change. I think the change comes with his daughter coming to stay and with him having to see the world through her eyes. And yes, he becomes a sort of kinder, gentler figure. And yes, that is just possible in those cases about what rights an individual has. That yes, he might change. I think you can't really write a novel about a character who's not willing to change. You have to dramatize that idea of the personality being dynamic. I think that has to be there.
What kind of a judge would you have made, Colm, do you think, had your career been a different one?
I mean, I really, I suppose, was part of that generation that came to view what Mary Robinson was doing and saying as being really important, and that if the Constitution, since the politicians couldn't move, then the law would have to be, you'd have to recourse to the law. But I really, really worry now about the prison system. Obviously, I'm in the United States where it's so overused. It is scandalous, and the way the prisons are run here in America is scandalous. And I do wonder if the prison system, the way of locking people up, is left over from some sort of medieval mindset where and that we are going to have to look at it again, because I mean, if you look at it not as a lawyer but as a sociologist, it is the poor who tend to be sentenced to more than the rich, and if that's the case, then that system doesn't work. I'm afraid my politics are so liberal on this question of prison. I just find the idea of it repulsive, and I think it should be used very sparingly. So I think I would not get appointed, actually. I think that's the answer to my question.
How much of that view might come from having witnessed what you saw in Spain and what you called effectively the birth of democracy there, watching votes being cast? How formative was that?
Yeah, that it gave you a sense that, I suppose, the Spanish Revolution and the Portuguese Revolution both were about personal rights. They really changed the lives of women, and indeed children and gay people. That it wasn't merely about the right to vote or the or the right to not get beaten up by the police, but it actually changed. The sort of gender war became part of the big issues there. So I suppose I thought that was important in Ireland, and hadn't really, that it looked as though the women's movement was a sort of a marginalized movement. But of course it moved to the center, but it took a long time.
It did. I'm just seeing, to my great amusement, Colm, someone has asked, what does Judge Gearty think of Eamonn Redmond? I must say I rather liked him. Nolene Blackwell has asked that question, and I think it's hard not to like him. Certainly by the end of the novel, as you say, Colm, he has grown, and it's very hard to live with someone and have seen his childhood and not sympathise with the man who wants to write a braver judgment but feels he can't. That was my lasting impression of Eamonn Redmond, but I really did like him. So he's a mixture of people, as I understand it, Colm. Is that a reasonable summary?
Yes, it's more, but it's more. I imagined him, and I gave him, as I say, my father, myself. But I was using things I had seen and heard from various judges that I went to see for the purposes of journalism.
Lovely. I'm going to bring us to a close now because I'm conscious of time. This has given me great joy, I must say, this conversation. It's been such a pleasure just to hear you and to have the privilege of asking you some questions. I just want to say thank you, obviously, to the organisers, and in particular to Anita Finucane, to Catherine Needham, and all of the Young Bar Committee who invited me to do this, gave me this great privilege. Thank you. Aoife Canarney for the technical support. I'm coming through on a phone that is presumably also taking messages. I don't know how bad the sound has been for you, but for me it's been excellent, so I hope it has been good for everyone else. But above all, Colm, thank you once again for agreeing to an interview at all, but particularly at 9 a.m, as I believe it is there. So you're bringing a ray of sunshine, not just from Los Angeles, but from Wexford, I think, very definitely. I think of it as I speak to you now, and it really reminds me of the beautiful passages. You're a board fáilte, Ange, let's face it, for Wexford in particular, and we're very, very proud of you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rose Gearty. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you.